All right, so we're doing something pretty cool today, taking a deep dive into the Ford Trimotor.
The Tin Goose.
Right, yeah, the Tin Goose. Now, you probably think Ford cars, right?
Most people do.
Exactly, but Ford getting into planes, that's a whole other story. And this wasn't just any plane. The Ford Trimotor, it actually changed how people thought about flying, and that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating.
It really is. You got to picture the 1920s. Flying was scary business back then.
Yeah.
People were more likely to imagine themselves in a crash than arriving safely.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And then in steps, Ford, a name that even back then meant reliable, dependable.
So to have them making planes.
Huge.
It's like if some mega corporation today said, hey, we're building passenger rockets, you'd pay attention.
Absolutely.
Okay, so Ford makes planes, but why the Trimotor? Why 3 engines? Was that just a Ford thing to be extra?
It's a good question, and honestly one I bet gets asked a lot. 3 engines, especially those big radial engines, we're talking 420 horsepower each. It was all about safety.
Safety, how so?
Back then, losing an engine in the air was an if it was when. Having
right.
2 backup engines, well, that gave you a chance to at least try to land safely.
So it wasn't just a design quirk. It was a lifesaver.
Exactly.
But the plane itself, I mean, it has that look. Like other planes from that time period, what were its influences?
Well, Ford definitely took some inspiration from Fokker, the Dutch aircraft company, specifically their FEI model. You can see it in the overall layout, the high wing design. But Ford took that and made it their own, especially with that all-metal construction. Really groundbreaking back then.
And that's where the Tin Goose comes from.
You got it, all that metal.
Yeah.
Most planes then were still wood and fabric. So the Ford Trimotor with its aluminum skin, it would seem so modern, maybe even a little industrial.
Yeah, Tin Goose. Not exactly the most elegant nickname.
True, but it wasn't meant to be mean. It was more like what you'd call a reliable workhorse. The plane was tough, it got the job done, and people knew it.
It's interesting how a nickname can tell you so much about what people actually thought about something.
Really is.
So Ford used that trust they built with cars to sell planes, but how'd they convince people that flying wasn't only for daredevils?
Well, their marketing was really smart. They really emphasized the safety angle with those 3 engines, but they also used the public's trust in the Ford name. It was brilliant, really. It was like, you trust our cars, you can trust our planes.
Yeah.
Simple but effective.
Wow.
They even did these big publicity stunts to show off how reliable and easy to use the Trimotor was. They really went all out.
That's impressive. Okay, so they're selling safety, but what about the actual experience of flying in one of these things? Was the Tin Goose any more comfortable than other planes back then? Because I'm picturing cramped seats and noisy engines.
You're not wrong about the engines. Those radial engines were loud, let me tell you. And the vibration, you wouldn't believe it. Earplugs were basically a requirement.
Ouch.
But compared to the competition, the Ford Trimotor was actually pretty comfy. It had an enclosed cabin, which meant passengers weren't out in the elements anymore. Big improvement.
That's huge. I bet that was a game changer, especially for those longer flights. No more windburn or freezing temperatures while you're up in the air.
Huge difference. Plus, they added things like caneback seats. Might not sound fancy now, but back then that was like luxury air travel.
Yeah.
They even had a lavatory on board.
A lavatory. On a plane in the 1920s. Now that's progress. It really makes you think.
Speaking of progress, the Ford Trimotor was also part of that famous coast-to-coast transcontinental air service.
Yeah.
That must have blown people's minds back then.
Absolutely. Imagine before that, going from one coast of the U.S. to the other could take weeks, even months. The Ford Trimotor helped cut that down to just 48 hours.
48 hours?
Yeah.
That's still pretty impressive.
I agree.
Even by today's standards. Wait a minute, though. It wasn't all planes, was it? I thought I read something about trains being involved, too.
You're right. It was a team effort. That coast-to-coast service was actually a relay system. Passengers would fly during the day on the Ford Trimotor, and then at night they'd switch over to these fancy sleeper trains.
So it was more like coast to coast, with a little help from the railroads. Exactly. But even with the trains involved, being able to cross the whole country in less than 2 days was a huge deal back then. It really captured people's imaginations and cemented the Ford Trimotor's place in aviation history.
It really does make you think about how much our ideas of speed and convenience have changed over time. You know what I find really interesting, though? It's the stories of the individual planes themselves. Like, we found some info about one specific Trimotor, and let me tell you, this plane had a life.
Oh, you must be talking about the 5AT 11 model, the one on display at the San Diego Air and Space Museum. Now that one has a story.
That's the one. This plane did everything, from flying for Pan Am to hauling cargo in Alaska, and then get this, it ended up at someone's house.
You're not kidding. It started out flying that glamorous Miami to Cuba route for Pan American Airways. Then it went on to work for a bunch of different airlines in Central and South America, passengers, cargo, you name it. Even spent some time in Mexico hauling supplies to mining camps.
Wow, talk about a career change. That plane really got around. Who knew a tin Goose could have such an interesting resume?
Well, they were built tough, that's for sure. But the story doesn't end there. This particular tri-motor was eventually bought by a private owner, and get this, he converted it into a house in Mexico. Even put in a wood-burning stove, ran the chimney right up through the roof.
You've got to be kidding me. That's incredible. To think it went from those luxury passenger routes to being someone's home in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
Thankfully, it didn't end there, though, right?
Not at all. The San Diego Air and Space Museum heard about it, and they rescued it. They restored it painstakingly back to its former glory. Even got the original Pan American livery on it.
What a great ending to an amazing story. So if anyone's ever in San Diego, you know what to do.
Absolutely. Seeing that plane up close, knowing everything it's been through, it's an incredible experience. Really brings history to life.
It really makes you think about things differently when you hear stories like that. It's one thing to read about the Ford Tri-Motor in a book, but to know that one was actually someone's home, it just makes history so much more real.
It reminds us that history is more than just dates and names. It's about the people who lived through those times, and in this case, the planes. This tri-motor, it shows you how clever and long-lasting Ford's design really was. They built things to last back then.
They sure did. Not like today.
Hey!
But speaking of lasting legacies, let's bring it back to you. You wanted to learn more about the Ford Tri-Motor, and now, well, you're not just reciting facts, you're getting the whole picture.
That's right. You understand what was going on back then, all that fear around flying?
Yeah.
And then Ford, this giant company, steps into the scene. It's a big deal.
And you seen how Ford was so smart with how they marketed these planes? They used those publicity stunts and people's trust in the Ford name to make flying seem less scary. It wasn't just about selling a plane, it was about selling the idea that flying could be safe, reliable, even enjoyable.
And it worked. It's amazing how much things have changed. Though I guess some things never do. Like we still want to get places fast and easily. Remember that coast-to-coast service? Imagine taking that trip today. But instead of a few hours, it's a 48-hour adventure with planes and trains. Just like they did it back then.
That's an interesting thought.